Hello. Today I'd like to do a little bit of a comparison. I talk often relate information from the Russian Ministry of Defense, their Telegram channel, and tonight I'd like to maybe compare and contrast that a little bit with what we get from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense's Telegram channel. See what we can determine by having a look through the content they both provide, and then also like to take a look at some of the RIBAR reporting, just so that we can get a bit of a feel for the different flavors of reporting and information that comes out from three different sources. Obviously, RIBAR are a Russian pro-Russian site, but different again to the Ministry of Defense. Starting off with some information today from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. He has been at a Defense Ministry Board meeting session, and he has stated that since the 4th of June 2023, the armed forces of Ukraine have launched 263 attacks at Russian positions. He's claimed that these have all been repelled. I think perhaps the bulk of these, there is truth that the bulk of these have been repelled from the reporting we've seen, although there's some areas where it seems as though the Russians may have retreated in areas around the Skuchny and this sort of thing, where perhaps some of the smaller hamlets have been claimed by the Ukrainians. Now, further, according to Shoigu at the Defense Ministry Board session, he believes that the Ukrainian armed forces have plans to launch strikes at Russian Federation territory, including Crimea, using HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles. This has led to him to comment that if this is the case, that this will be regarded as direct involvement of the US and the UK in the conflict and will result in immediate retaliatory strikes at decision-making centres in Ukraine territory. So we can see that there is some sort of level of escalation going on here, with the Defence Minister calling this out explicitly, that they expect to see these attacks, and if they do see them, they will retaliate with attacks onto Ukrainian command centres. Shoigu, it's not worth noting, has recently been in the news over his request to have all volunteer forces operating as part of the special military operation sign contracts with the Russian Military of Defense. In particular, Evgeny Prigozhin, the very outspoken head of the Wagner PMC, who rose to fame through their battle in the Bakhmut, or Artyomsk, as the Russians now refer to that city as. Evgeny Prigozhin has flat out rejected any desire or request from Shoigu to sign contracts for his fighters. Interestingly, Shoigu actually, or is reportedly the head of the Storm Z PMC, another private military company. And many feel that some of the issue between Shoigu and Prigozhin is due to the fact that they're both heads of private military companies, and that Prigozhin may see Shoigu as unfairly favouring his own Storm Z when they are in battle. Anyhow, interesting. All right, so before I get into the three different areas we want to talk about tonight, I'll start off with some of the reporting over the last 24 hours from the RIBAR Telegram channel. So some of this is interesting. It parallels quite well with the Russian Ministry of Defense, but provides additional information as well. Of interest, they indicate RIBAR are reporting that Russian troops launched massive strikes on targets in Ukraine today, and in the far west of Ukraine, in Lviv, the SBU building was hit. So this is interesting because this is over on the very far western side of Ukraine. The Russians are reaching out there clearly with some of their long-range missiles, and report that they have hit the SBU building there. Further, they report that in Kiev and Khmelnytsky that other AFU facilities were hit today. Rybar reporting that the armed forces of Ukraine increased the intensity of shelling of the Bryansk region. Now, this Bryansk is on the border. It's in the north of Ukraine and just in Russia, getting up near the border with Belarus. They're reporting that the villages Braklov, Azrokovka and Kurkovichi came under Ukrainian fire, with residential buildings and civil infrastructure being damaged. So again, over the last week, we're seeing more and more of these attacks over the Russian border, getting up near the Belarusian border with Ukraine. The Belgorod region, these sort of things. Now, these will be claimed by the Ukrainians to be probing attacks, and I believe that they are probing to try to understand what sort of retaliation, what Russian forces may be there. But also, I believe these are being done to put pressure onto Putin and the Kremlin, as he's now having to deal with the fact that he has Russian civilians being shelled in their homes, which obviously is not something that a leader wants. So I think this is part of the pressure that the Ukrainians are trying to apply here. Further, Rybar go on to say that fighting has intensified near Crimea, which is near Severodonetsk in the Luhansk region, where Russian paratroopers occupied several AFU strongholds in the Serebryansky forestry. There's also reporting from other sources of a possible Russian advance near Crimea towards Liman to the west and up to the north to the Kupiansk directions. And if that's the case, that would seem to indicate a push towards Kharkiv. Now, these are early reports. I haven't been able to corroborate them yet, so it's something I'll watch in the next few days to see if the Russians are in some areas deciding to actually go on the offensive, if they feel like they may have detected weakness of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in certain areas and believe that there is benefit in advancing in some spots. In this area, Rybar are reporting that the Ukrainians have been attempting to keep the situation under control and to retard the Russian advances by pouring on massive artillery strikes. Reports, though, that this has actually caused some friendly fire today and has landed on some of their own positions, which is not what you want in an artillery battle. Moving south from here in the direction of Soledar, so now we're looking just northeast of Bakhmut or Artyomsk, as the Russians refer to the city now. The Ukrainians are calling it Bakhmut. The armed forces of Ukraine have launched a series of attacks on Russian positions near Yakovlivka and Sako-Ivantseti. The reports are that all of these attempts to advance by the Ukrainians have been suppressed by small arms and artillery fire. Now, they're also reporting that Russian troops have launched a massive strike on military facilities in the Zaporizhia region. Interestingly, this seems to perhaps indicate that perhaps some of the Russian satellites that have been released into orbit recently, there's been 5 or so released over the last 4 or 5 months, may be starting to increase the ability or the capability of the Russians to see into areas, into Ukraine with more ease, as some of the locations that were hit in this strike are reported as being hotels and holiday homes. So here it would appear that they are targeting forces who are being held in reserve or are being rotated out, but are in large enough numbers in some areas that the Russians are able to detect them and now strike them. Also, reports are that equipment repair bases in the Zaporizhia region were hit in these strikes. Overall, Rybar are reporting that in Zaporizhia, the front line has not changed significantly. The Ukrainians continue their attacks in the direction of Robotne. Now, Robotne is about 12 kilometers south of Orikhiv and about 20 kilometers northeast of Tokmak. And reports from Rybar is that these attacks in the direction of Robotny have been repelled. Moving to the west, we've got heavy fighting continues near Pyatikhatya, where I have to practice pronouncing that name, my apologies. Russian units here seem to be following what's becoming a common tactic displayed by the Russians, where they have left the village after occupying it and then have withdrawn to previously prepared positions on the surrounding heights to resume artillery attacks on the area once the Ukrainians attempt to move in and retake the area. So this seemingly ideological difference in the military approaches between Russia and Ukraine does seem to be having detrimental effects on the Ukrainian army, which is this what seems to be an approach of the Russians being very willing to fall back and not fight tooth and nail for any position or territory that they've won. Instead, seemingly to advance, identify where they can retreat to, and be prepared to do that whenever they need to. Whereas the Ukrainians, particularly at the moment with the pressure to make some advances and wins during this offensive in order to be able to demonstrate to NATO and the Western nations that their investment in Ukraine has been of some benefit to them. That pressure certainly seems to be leading to the Ukrainians fighting to gain territory and then holding onto that territory and being far more reluctant to retreat if that would make sense and would conserve forces. Okay, so that's the Rybar reporting. Just want to talk a little bit about some of the reporting that comes out from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Now, first of all, I must say the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense produces a very different type of content. Their daily reports are often far more emotive. They tend to include produced video, almost like show reels of dramatic battle scenes, prisoners and bodies on the ground, and they provide a far less detailed summary of the day's activities, both in terms of Ukrainian successes and in terms of Russian activity, as compared to the Russian Ministry of Defense, which we'll get to in a moment. But just as a little bit of a review of the reporting that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has provided over the last couple of days. In summary, on the 19th, they indicate 630 Russian soldiers perhaps killed and wounded, and 42 vehicles destroyed, Russian vehicles destroyed. And then on the 20th, so yesterday, 1,010 Russian soldiers killed and 23 enemy artillery systems destroyed. Now, this is interesting that Ukrainians are claiming that over 1,000 Russian soldiers were killed on the front line today. Yesterday, the 20th. When we look at the Russian numbers, given the reporting that seems to be coming out both in the West, that Ukraine is having a very tough time of this battle, you see Western reports now in the Western media indicating that this is to be expected, that nobody ever said this would be easy, but they still believe that the Ukrainians have what they need to defeat the Russians. When we see some reporting coming out, like even from General Petraeus, American famous general from just before the start of the offensive, that by all accounts they were expecting to, within 72 to 96 hours, have advanced down towards the Sea of Azov. This corroborates with some reporting today of some Ukrainian prisoners of war who are indicating that their tactics were to advance down from where they had started in the Crimea region, work their way down towards Tokmak, meet up with two other groups advancing from other areas in a short period of time. All of this seems to indicate that the Ukrainians are having a tough time of this offensive and that their losses are very heavy. And this has obviously been evidenced by some of the footage that came out 2 weeks ago at the start of this offensive, where we saw the large columns of tanks and artillery, and mobile artillery and armour being caught and destroyed in the minefields, with losses of Leopards and American Bradleys. All of this on one side, and then the Ukrainians claiming that there were 1,000 killed Russian soldiers yesterday. They also have claimed, this is from the Ministry of Defense for Ukraine's Telegram channel, that the Russians have shelled the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. This is an interesting claim, given that the Russians hold and control the Zaporizhia power plant at the moment. It seems unusual that they would shell the plant while they were there. There are other reports that the Russians have mined around the plant. Now that makes complete sense, and I imagine there's truth in that. The Russians clearly wish to hold on to that power plant, I imagine for a number of reasons, for power generation purposes during the conflict, because they would like to maintain it in a working state so that should they advance further west through Ukraine, that the power plant remains undamaged and can be used in the future. So mining around the area, particularly now, given that the Kakhovka dam wall has been blown and the reservoir, which did, until the dam was destroyed, provide a 5-kilometre wide water barrier between the Zaporozhye power plant and the northern side of the northern or western side of the Dnieper River, where the Ukrainians are. Yes, given that this has now been lost, and there seems to be a now just a mud flat which is slowly drying out, mining that area so as to stop Ukrainian advances there makes complete sense. Also, they mentioned that they blame the Russians for the Kakhovka dam being destroyed, and that they mentioned the talk of Russia creating a dirty bomb and speculate that this may be a real threat. Now, again, this is another interesting comment. There's many ways and layers to look at this, but the Russians would have no need to generate a dirty bomb. The Russians have many tactical nuclear warheads. If they wanted to use a nuclear warhead, you would imagine, use one which would be safe and reliable. Now, you could claim that they may want to do it and make it look like the Ukrainians had done it. That's possible. However, the Ukrainians have no nuclear weapons. So if anyone was going to be appearing with a dirty bomb, it would seem that it would maybe more likely that it would be the Ukrainians, in that may be the only option that they have at that time, is to create a dirty bomb. The Americans wouldn't provide them with a tactical nuke that could be analysed and diagnosed and determined that it was an American one. That itself would cross a line which I don't think the Americans are prepared to cross. Again, the Russians, their doctrine for nuclear weapons has always been that they would only use them in a defensive position, so that if they were threatened first with one, they would then use nuclear weapons. The United States has a slightly different doctrine. I don't believe theirs explicitly excludes them using it first if they needed to. Anyhow, this is an interesting comment from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense on their Telegram channel. And putting all of these things together, the brevity of their reporting, the lack of detail, their claims about the Russians shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, this talk of a dirty bomb and speculating this may be a real threat from the Russians. I'll let you read into this what you want, but I suggest that you go and read the Telegram channel and have a look at some of this information for yourself. You'll notice it's a very different flavour to what the Russians provide. So moving on to that. So the Ministry of Defence update for the 20th for yesterday from Russia. There's a lot of detail in here, but I'll get into this, and as we go through this, I think you'll notice the differences. They start with the comments that the Ukraine armed forces have continued their unsuccessful attempts to conduct defensive operations in South Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk directions during the previous 24 hours. 4 attacks launched by the Ukrainian motorized infantry units, reinforced by tanks, were repelled by coordinated actions of the Vostok group of forces, aviation, artillery, and heavy flamethrowers in Vremevka salient and Orekov tactical direction. So the Vremevka salient is the area up near where Neskuchne is, and where there has been fighting over some of these small hamlets in here. There's also been heavy fighting in the Orekov area. Their reports are that 3 tanks and 5 armoured fighting vehicles were destroyed yesterday in this area. Interesting to note, as we progress through the reporting from yesterday, is that there doesn't seem to be reports of Leopards and Bradleys being destroyed in this fighting now, which makes one wonder if the Ukrainians have either decided themselves or have been told to pull the Leopards and remaining Bradleys back so as to minimise the amount of negative press about them being destroyed. There have been reports from MI6 that MI6 have requested that the Ukrainians do not use any Challenger tanks when they become available, and I've seen what I believe to be pictures of one in Ukraine, that they not be used at the vanguard position in the front of a column of armour when it's advancing. Again, it would seem so as to minimise the likelihood of an immediate loss of such a vaunted piece of equipment and the negative impact that would have on the ability for the British Army to sell Challenger tanks globally. Also, again, mentioned here in this area of the Vremevka salient and Orekov that the use of the flamethrowers are the TOS-1 mobile tank-mounted multiple rocket launch systems used by the Russians with the thermobaric warheads in them. Those warheads are full of fuel and cause a dreadful, massive fireball explosion which can reach down into trenches, buildings. So it's often used in areas where there's heavy, or like advanced use of trenches or deep trenches. Okay. The Ministry of Defence go on to state that in addition, 4 clusters of enemy manpower and equipment were engaged near Novopol in the Donetsk People's Republic and Levadno in the Zaporozhye region. In the direction of Polygi, actions of one sabotage and reconnaissance group of the Ukrainian forces have been thwarted in the Zaporozhye region. The total enemy losses in the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye directions overnight were up to 260 Ukrainian servicemen, 9 tanks, a Bradley fighting vehicle, 12 armoured fighting vehicles, 3 motor vehicles, 2 D-20 howitzers, 2 M-Star-B howitzers, as well as a US-made M777 artillery system. They go on to state that in the Donetsk direction, the Yug group of forces repelled 10 enemy attacks close to Krasnogorovka, Avdiivka and Mariinka in the Donetsk People's Republic, and up to 220 Ukrainian personnel, 3 armoured fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, an M-Star-B howitzer and another US-made M777 artillery system has been neutralised. Moving on to the Kupiansk direction. So in the Kupiansk region, the Zapad group of forces inflicted damage on the AFU close to Kislovka, Novovilinsk and Berestovoye in the Kharkov region, and Stelmakovka in the Lugansk People's Republic. In addition, the actions of 3 sabotage and reconnaissance groups were thwarted near Sinkovka in Kharkov region and Novoselovskoye Yagodnoye in the Lugansk People's Republic. Here we see further reporting of a change in tactics for the Ukrainians, where we get more reports of these sabotage and reconnaissance groups, where it appears that the Ukrainians are moving away from the large armoured column attacks, which they started unsuccessfully a couple of weeks ago, and moving towards smaller groups of men. An article which I read on Twitter today, which I might dive into more in the coming week, spoke about the changing landscape of the war And given the ability now using satellites and drones to be able to see your enemy's positions, see their groupings, that large force activities, big arrow pushes, and that type of thing may now be more difficult to coordinate and deliver, purely due to the fact that if your enemy can see that you're starting to amass your troops behind your lines in towns and at marshalling areas, if you can see that, well, now if you can strike them, then they immediately lose the ability to mount that attack. This was a very interesting article talking about how the drone capability, how satellite capability was now meaning that both strategy and tactics in warfare needs to account for this change, because this isn't something that in, say, World War II or Vietnam that you had. We didn't at those stages have satellite capabilities and had limited ability to look over and see your opponents. Now, the Americans of Vietnam had some high-flying planes, which the Vietnamese with their Chinese supplied aircraft would struggle to take out, but still the ability through the jungle there wasn't great. Today, in the large open fields of Ukraine, very difficult to amass troops to get ready for a fight in a safe way. And as the reporting earlier mentioned and referred to, where strikes were made on holiday hotels and resorts where it appears that Ukrainian soldiers may have been congregating. Anyhow, so in that Kupiansk region, they summarise with up to 40 Ukrainian servicemen, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 motor vehicles, another M777, and a Zupark counter-battery radar station had been destroyed. Now, in the direction of Krasny Liman, heavy flamethrower systems, the TOS ones, were employed again by the 10th group, and they have hit Ukrainian forces in a number of areas in Donetsk People's Republic, Nevskoye, and the Lugansk People's Republic area of Chervonaya Dibrova. Again, they mention in this area in Chernovaya Dibrova and south of Crimea that sabotage and reconnaissance groups were thwarted, and that up to 100 Ukrainian troops, 3 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, a Grad MLRS vehicle, a D-20 howitzer, and 1 Akatsiya self-propelled artillery gun had been eliminated in this direction during the day. Now, when they're talking about the vehicles being eliminated, I think we know what they mean. When they talk about 100 Ukrainian troops, I think here that they may mean a mixture of killed and wounded. In the Kherson direction, up to 25 Ukrainian troops, 5 motor vehicles, another M777, a D-30 howitzer have been destroyed within the last 24 hours. And 8 ammunition depots were destroyed during the day. The Ukrainian 3rd Armoured Brigade near the settlement of Dvorechnaya in Kharkov region, the 45th Artillery Brigade near the city of Seversk in the Donetsk People's Republic, the Zaporozhye group of troops of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade and the 65th Mechanized Brigade, as well as the 106th and 122nd Brigades of the Territorial Defence near the city of Ochakov in the Nikolaev region, and the Tiangika Kherson region. So that's 8 ammunition depots. There was some reporting yesterday of a Russian ammunition depot having been struck by Ukrainian forces. That wasn't reported in the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, but I did see that to some Russian reporters. However, here the Ministry of Defense is indicating they have destroyed 8 Ukrainian ammunition depots in the last 24 hours. Finally, Russian air defense forces have intercepted 7 HIMARS, they say shells during the day, but these are HIMARS missiles during the day, and that 13 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles were destroyed during yesterday's fighting. So that's the update from the Russian Ministry of Defense today. We also had the update from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and from Rybar. I think you can see that they're very different in the way that they present the details of the previous day's activity. The Russian Ministry of Defense, very detailed. They provide spoken summaries on their Telegram channel from some of the press and communications leaders of the different groups. And their reporting seems to be running in parallel with what you get from Rybar and a number of other sites. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense seems far less detailed in its reporting, makes other claims which are sometimes quite interesting when you drill into them. Provide far more video, as I say, more. It looks more like content aimed at a general consumer or to be used in social media with, as I say, dramatic scenes and sometimes elements of music in there, fighting and victorious scenes. Almost feels as though instead of just providing the detail, they're trying to convince you of a narrative. That's the feel that I get from reading these different sources. Okay, just a little more. Just some peripheral details around what's happened in the last day or so. More reports of Ukrainian soldiers being captured. The numbers of Ukrainian prisoners of war seem to be growing, not in huge numbers, but more than just ones and twos, sometimes in small groups, and even there are some reports of like almost company size groups surrendering to the Russians. In terms of how long this conflict might go on, well, there's some reports today that the Western funding and the Western commitment isn't slowing down. The EU, there's been an announcement, the EU plans to commit another $50 billion to Ukraine over the next 4 years. And a Pentagon spokeswoman, Sabrina Singh, and this is something I spoke about a couple of weeks ago, the accounting error made by the Pentagon, where the Pentagon, when estimating how much material they had provided to Ukraine, were apparently reportedly using the replacement value of that equipment rather than the book value. So where they were sending over a Bradley, which might have been replacement value, let's just say $20 million, but the book value of it was only $16 million. It had been used, it had a few scratches. So this they have now reviewed, and over 2022 and 2023, the number has now been settled up on as being $6.2 billion accounting discrepancy. Now, this $6.2 billion accounting discrepancy leans in favour of the Ukrainians and the abilities to supply equipment. Effectively, the American military, the Pentagon, now has another $6.2 billion, which it can use to assign additional equipment to Ukraine. And while I'm not sure if this is, in fact, I think this is separate, but US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has announced that a new military aid package will be announced tomorrow by the US government. So things not slowing down. It seems the fighting is still carrying on really at a tremendous pace. I know that in some cases it sounds as though it is slowing, and there may well be some pauses on the Ukrainian side as they attempt to regroup and modify their tactics to try to achieve more. But again, I think part of what we're experiencing here is just a lull in some of the reporting coming out of the front lines. As I say, it will be interesting in August when the Wagner group are back in the battle to see what happens then, as in the past they've been very vocal about reporting activities. Just finally today, there was another drone attack on Moscow. And the Kremlin's reporting that 3 of these aircraft-type drones were flown and attempted to strike. They are claiming that all 3 of them were overwhelmed by electronic warfare, which caused them to lose control and crashed. And because of this, there were no casualties or damages reported in Russia. All right, that's it for tonight. If you like the channel, please subscribe, tell your friends, and get the word out. Thanks.